Episode 8, The Problem with Commodus, 180 to 189 AD. Hi there, welcome back to 202 Decades. You may notice that we are rapidly approaching the end of the 2nd century, and that means it is once again time for listener questions. Please send in any questions you have about the years from 100 to 199 AD. I'll be pausing for a couple of episodes after the 190s to summarize the century, give a few thoughts on trends, and to answer your questions. You can send those questions to 202decades@gmail.com. That's 202decades@gmail.com. Thanks. Last time, we saw Marcus Aurelius in his prime, stoically pushing back the barbarian hordes, defeating them on their own turf, all while administering his empire and dealing with an insurrection from a trusted general. Just when he finally allowed himself to celebrate a triumph, the northern barbarians decided they weren't done fighting the Romans yet. The wars just would not end. This decade, though, we will finally see the end of these wars, and the end of Marcus, too. Fortunately for Rome, the Philosopher King's son and successor would share his father's patience, wisdom, and care, right? Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1. The Death of Marcus Aurelius. Part 2. Commodus's First Years. Part 3. Paranus. Part 4. Cleander. Part 5. Commodus himself. Part 1. The Death of Marcus Aurelius. On March 17th of the year 180, in a frontier military camp, Marcus Aurelius breathed his last. His death reflected his life, raised in Rome for philosophy, but spending his later years at war with the barbarians. Although by nature a lover of philosophy, his duty to the empire had led him to accept a martial life, leading the armies, defending the borders, pushing through his persistent illnesses and weaknesses. His iron will kept him going. For 19 years, Marcus had dutifully stewarded the Roman Empire through war, invasion, plague, and rebellion. Now, at the age of 58, his diseases finally caught up with him. Or that's one possibility. The alternative is that Marcus was murdered. Cassius Dio says, "He passed away on the 17th of March, not as a result of the diseases from which he still suffered, but by the act of his physicians, as I have been plainly told, who wished to do Commodus a favor." So, was Marcus actually killed in a plot by his son? Probably not, despite what's depicted in the movie Gladiator. It's more likely Dio's comment was fueled by later attitudes about Commodus written in the aftermath of his coming depravity and downfall. No, Marcus had long suffered illness, and as we saw with the episode involving Avidius Cassius last decade, rumors of his death had even sparked a rebellion in the past by an over-eager general. It was almost certainly illness that killed Marcus. When I first began preparing for these episodes spanning the reign of Marcus Aurelius, my opinion of him was not high. He at first seemed like a weak philosopher with his head stuck in the spheres while his empire convulsed around him. Maybe his upbringing in the palace had made him soft. After spending more time with him, though, my opinion on him has flipped. Perhaps he was soft in the beginning, but over the years, he responded to the needs of his empire with admirable will and determination. For all the pain the Marcomannic Wars caused the border provinces, they could have been much, much worse. With a less competent emperor leading Rome, whole provinces could have fallen out of the empire. Italy may have suffered invasion and destruction. Yes, maybe Marcus pursued the Germans too far, maybe the wars dragged on too long. But the Marcomannic coalition seems equally to blame. Marcus Aurelius continued the fighting for years on end because he was looking for a final solution. Part of that solution was his plan to make two new provinces out of enemy lands across the Danube River, called Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This is what Marcus had been building up to in his last years, winning battles and building forts in this territory. If he had been successful, it's possible that Rome could have avoided some of its future disasters. That Commodus will completely abandon his father's grand vision is telling of their difference in personality. Shortly after Marcus's death, Commodus abandoned his father's plans of expansion and made peace with the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Iazyges. It was immediately clear Commodus was not going to follow his father's path. This brings us to perhaps the best criticism of Marcus Aurelius. He allowed his son Commodus to be his heir. The Roman Empire over the prior 200 years was unusual as far as monarchies or empires go, in that the passing of rule from father to son had been rare. The transition from Vespasian to Titus and then Domitian in the second half of the first century is the only time it had happened. The first four of the five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius, are especially noted or praised for their selection of good men rather than selecting their own sons. The problem with this, though, is that none of these men had the opportunity to appoint their own natural sons. We're giving them credit for something they could not do. And each time an emperor did have the opportunity to make his son an heir, he took it. Marcus did not know how his son would turn out, but in all his stoic detachment, we might expect him to have seen the writing on the wall and picked a better heir. It seems his paternal favoritism broke through his usual wisdom. Aside from who Marcus chose as heir, his preparation for his successor was focused and deliberate. He brought Commodus on campaign beginning in 172, and Commodus traveled with his father to the east following the revolt of Avidius Cassius. Commodus had seen the realities of the emperor's duties. Upon returning to Rome, Commodus was made a consul and an Augustus in 177. This made him the youngest consul and emperor yet, although really Marcus was still in charge. In Marcus's last months, Commodus was with him, overseeing the northern campaigns. As Marcus grew ill and realized this time he would not recover, he began to worry over his son. Two fears troubled him. First, that becoming emperor at such a young age would corrupt Commodus, and the new young emperor would follow the mold of so many child rulers of the past to debauchery and ruin. Second, he feared the response of the Germans. He worried that with his death, their German allies would become enemies again. The thought that calmed Marcus's worries was the presence of many skilled and wise advisors around himself, who could shepherd Commodus through his youth. It was a good thought. Nero's advisors had been able to lead the empire well until Nero's impulses had overthrown their counsels. Soon enough, Marcus's worrying came to an end, and he passed from this world. We get a report of the people's reaction from the historian Herodian. Yes, you may be noticing that this is the first mention of Herodian. This Roman historian begins his history with the death of Marcus. Finally, we get another written source beyond the fragments of Cassius Dio and the fanciful gossip of the Historia Augusta. Anyways, Herodian writes, Marcus died, leaving to men of his own time a legacy of regret, to future ages an eternal memorial of excellence. All cried out in a swelling chorus, calling him kind father, noble emperor, brave general, and wise moderate ruler. And every man spoke the truth. Goodbye, Marcus Aurelius. Part 2. Commodus's First Years. In the first weeks of Commodus's sole reign, he continued the plans of his father. He spoke to the soldiers in his camp and gave to all the legions the customary donative to buy their loyalty. Marcus's old circle of advisors led him well, and the campaigns continued for a short while. Then, out of nowhere, Commodus declared that the wars should end. Some of his court companions had seduced him with the idea of returning to the pleasures of Italy, instead of roughing it out here on the frontier. Pompeianus, his brother-in-law, and his advisors tried to change his mind. But he dismissed his advisors, and against the advice of his generals, he quickly brokered a peace deal with the Marcomanni and the Quadi. Now, warfare didn't totally cease. There were smaller continued campaigns in the land of the Iazyges, but the main operations were done, and peace with the Marcomanni and the Quadi was secured. After the unrelenting campaigns of Marcus, I'm sure both tribes were eager to make peace, especially on such light terms. Commodus had abandoned his father's plans of conquest. Squatting around the muddy Danube had grown tiring for the young emperor. It was time to go home. In October of 180 AD, Commodus passed through Pannonia and the spine of Italy, each city on the path receiving him with pomp. As he approached Rome, the Senate came out to greet him. The people of the city had high expectations too. The young emperor's pedigree inspired confidence. He was a descendant of many great emperors. He was, of course, the son of Marcus Aurelius. His mother, Faustina, was the daughter of Antoninus Pius, who himself had been adopted by Hadrian, who had been adopted by Trajan. In triumph, Commodus rode through the streets of Rome to the temple of Jupiter. He addressed the Senate and soldiers who escorted him, and entered the imperial palace. For the first decade of his reign, Commodus deferred to his advisors and allowed them to rule in his stead. First with Sauterus, then Perinus, and finally Cleander. In the earliest part of his reign, his chief advisor was Sauterus. This was his chamberlain, who was so close to Commodus that he had ridden beside the emperor in the chariot upon his triumphal entrance to Rome. Sauterus held the reins of power while Commodus explored his hobbies. In the Senate, many quickly grew a hatred for him. Sauterus routinely passed up senators for appointments in the provinces, instead placing corrupt men personally loyal to him in the key posts. With the Senate feeling disrespected, it wasn't long before plots began to brew. The feelers of senatorial disaffection found friends within the palace itself. The oldest sister of Commodus, Lucilla, was married to Pompeianus, the man who was perhaps the closest ally of their deceased father. While Marcus Aurelius lived, Lucilla had enjoyed a degree of political privilege and the title Augusta, dating from her days as the wife of Lucius Verus, the old co-emperor of Marcus. Her new husband, Pompeianus, had been seen as the most likely alternative to Commodus as heir. But when Commodus came into sole rule, Lucilla lost her title and much of her influence. The title of Augusta passed instead to Commodus's own wife, Crispina. Feeling cast aside and frustrated, Lucilla began to plot against her brother. With help from a senator named Quadratus, with whom she was supposedly having an affair, they recruited another hot-headed senator to eliminate Commodus. This was Quintianus, a nephew by marriage of Lucilla. The plan was to get Quintianus alone with Commodus, and then the knives could come out. Everything went well at first. The plot was not revealed ahead of time. As Commodus was entering the theater, Quintianus jumped out from the shadows of the corridor. Before he killed the emperor, he, like any good Hollywood villain, had to give his little speech. Pulling out a sword from his cloak, he said, "The Senate sends you this dagger." But this pause was his undoing. Quintianus's monologue gave the imperial guard enough time to step in and restrain him before he could get to Commodus. If the emperor had been distracted by extracurricular activities before, this attempt on his life had caught his full attention. The reprisals were quick. Quintianus, of course, was executed after more than a little enhanced interrogation. The co-conspirators were revealed. Quadratus was executed. Several other senators were also induced to commit suicide. Lucilla, being of the imperial family, wasn't executed publicly. Instead, she was exiled to the island of Capri and killed some months later. Her husband, Pompeianus, was not implicated in the assassination attempt, but he took this as a prime moment to retire from public life. It was a smart decision. This would not be the last round of purges. The last victim of Commodus's retaliation was Sauterus, his trusted chamberlain who had been running the empire. In the chaos following the assassination attempt, Commodus was quick to believe almost any accuser. Our sources disagree on who the primary accuser of Sauterus was, whether it was Perinus, the advisor who would take power for the next few years, or Cleander, who would take power after Perinus's own downfall. It's also left vague whether Commodus himself ordered the killing or whether Sauterus was murdered first and then Commodus gave his approval of the murder. Really, the murkiness of all these details makes sense. Our sources would have been operating on speculation after the fact on these internal court matters. Part 3. Perinus. All of this political turmoil, which had seen the deaths and exiles of many who were close to the emperor, only encouraged the emperor to withdraw further from ruling. We'll talk more about Commodus's personal qualities later, but for now, just imagine him off to the side, partying, hunting, commiserating with the dishonorables of society. But the empire couldn't run itself. With Commodus serially distracted and Sauterus gone, the Praetorian prefect took the reins of power. This prefect was Tygidius Perinus. Perinus must have had a knack for steering the will of the emperor. Over the next several years, from 182 to 185, Perinus effectively became the ruler of the empire. He used his sway over the emperor to strip down the Senate. Commodus again was eager to oblige, to sign off on this. After all, the assassin had said, "The Senate sends you this dagger." His Senate paranoia was high. These years saw the return of practices not seen since Nero or Caligula, confiscations. Perinus would cook up some supposed plot, the accused would be pushed into suicide, and their wealth or property would be seized. This unjust revenue stream went a few places. Paying off the army, which I'll talk more about soon, paying for Commodus's extravagant personal expenses, and, of course, making Perinus himself incredibly wealthy. Even as their colleagues were being eliminated, others among the Senate made Perinus wealthier still by bribing their way into prestigious appointments. All of this corruption made the Senate hate Perinus, even if they were participants in his briberies. As the mouthpiece of the emperor and the guy running the show, all appointments ran through Perinus. This included military legates. He removed legates from command who he felt weren't loyal enough. In their place, he appointed new legates who were personally tied to himself. Perinus chose political clients for these roles and even installed members of his own family into key military posts. As usual, the Senate was incensed. Many of the posts he was filling with friends and family were supposed to be reserved for senators. But by now, the Senate had lost its ability to protest. Their relationship with the emperor was severed and kept that way by Perinus. As the leader of the Praetorians, he used the guard to limit access to Commodus and to intimidate the Senate. All seemed to be going according to plan for the prefect. He was growing fabulously wealthy. He was creating a military structure personally loyal to him, not to Commodus. And he had removed those most likely to challenge his power through silencing or killing. But he forgot to take into account the average soldier, the legions who were loyal to their commanders. An arbitrary firing of a beloved legate could cause a flame of disgruntlement to spark. Exactly this happened in Britannia in the year 185. The legions there were tired, overworked, underpaid, out on the very edge of the world, but loyal to their general. One morning, the soldiers awoke to find their general gone. He had been recalled to Rome, and in his place was a soft, overdressed man from the capital, a man with no experience. A few days passed. Word arrived that Perinus had appointed this new general, and that he was doing the same thing across the empire. Was Perinus planning a coup? There followed a night of whispering intents, plans made in the dark. Without leave from their new general, 1,500 soldiers left their camp and began the long march to Rome. They were taking their complaint to the emperor. Coins had been collected with Perinus' son's own face printed on them, evidence of their treason. An audience with the emperor was the only solution. Perhaps 2 months later, the soldiers from Britain neared the capital. Rumor of their approach preceded them. Even the distracted emperor's attention was caught. He rode out with a personal guard to meet these soldiers from far Britannia. You can imagine the scene. The soldiers dusty and weary, but nearing their goal. The bright Italian sun beating down as they march along the well-paved Via Cassia. A messenger on horseback arrives and says the emperor himself is just across a small bridge. He has invited the leaders of the British soldiers to come and meet with him. A dozen of the soldiers split off from their comrades. While crossing the bridge, one reaches down and he's relieved to feel the cool of metal in his pouch. The coins are still there. As they crest the bridge, a regal tent comes into view straddling the road, blocking all traffic. The officers are searched for weapons and then enter the cool of the tent. On a dais is seated a young man in purple robes, the Augustus, Commodus. The officers bow and there follows a moment of silence. The emperor speaks. "Why is this, fellow soldiers? What does your presence signify?" The officers are ready with their response. "We are here because Perinus is plotting against you and intends to make his son emperor." Commodus considers their words. The man with the coins pulls them out of his pouch and holds them up. Cleander, the chamberlain of the emperor, steps forward, takes a coin, flips it over in his hand, then brings it to Commodus. He whispers in the emperor's ear, "This is an image of Perinus' son." Commodus inspects the coin for a moment. Here is silver proof of the soldier's words, proof of Perinus' treason. Commodus and Cleander lean in and whisper together. The soldiers can't hear their words. A moment later, though, Commodus declares that the British soldiers should be rewarded for their loyalty and dedication. Perinus, on the other hand, will pay the ultimate price for his treason. Outside the tent, another messenger races back to Rome and declares that Perinus has been sentenced to death. Perinus is taken off guard. It's far too late to spin a web of lies. He's killed by his very own Praetorian Guard. His body thrown to the crowds, who tear him apart. Perinus' wife and his sons are also killed. Okay, although dramatized, the key points and quotes from Commodus and the soldiers in that last section were accurate. Perhaps the story of Perinus is ringing some bells for you. I know it's a lot to remember back 16 episodes, but this incident and the whole story of Perinus sounds similar to the events of the late 20s and early 30s. Perinus had become a new Sejanus. Just as Sejanus ran the government for Tiberius and planned to make himself emperor, so too had Perinus done for Commodus. Their means of death matched too. The tales are almost suspiciously similar. Some have suggested that Cassius Dio specifically framed the events surrounding Perinus to resemble Sejanus. Whatever the truth of Perinus, he wouldn't be the last advisor to rise and fall while Commodus played. Part 4. Cleander. With the extrajudicial killing of Sautrus a few years earlier, a new position opened up as the Emperor's Chamberlain. It was a high-risk, high-reward job. You might be implicated in a plot and murdered, and you might get to amass a fortune running the government. Notice I said and not or. The new Chamberlain was a man named Cleander. He was a Phrygian by birth, meaning he was from central Anatolia or modern Turkey originally. As a youth, he had been taken to Rome as a slave, where he eventually bought his freedom and became a freedman. He must have been talented. He rose from being a porter in the palace to become the Chamberlain, the servant controlling the household of the emperor. While Perinus ran the show, Cleander kept under the radar, pulling strings where he could, but not making Perinus an outright enemy. He was waiting for his moment. And the coming of the British soldiers was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Our sources suggest Cleander seized this opportunity to make Commodus mistrust Perinus and have him killed. Others, though, have suggested deeper involvement. He may have invited the soldiers, or at least been in contact with them for a while, all to remove Perinus. Once the Praetorian prefect was out of his way, in 185, Cleander became the new de facto ruler of the empire. He filled the void left by Perinus, but returned to all his predecessors' same activities. Or nearly all of them. The incident with the British soldiers made him a little more careful with the military. When it came to bribery and selling offices to the highest bidder, though, Cleander was even worse than his predecessor. So Cleander, raised to greatness by the favor of fortune, bestowed and sold senatorships, military commands, procuratorships, governorships, and, in a word, everything. Every year there were 2 consuls who began the year and for whom the year was named. These were called ordinary consuls. Once upon a time, they would have been the only consuls all year. For a long time now, though, these ordinary consuls would serve only part of the year. Other men would become consuls partway through, called suffect consuls. The year wouldn't be named after them. Occasionally, the merry-go-round of consulship holders wouldn't stop at these 4 men. Sometimes there would be even more. It may not have been as prestigious a role as ordinary consul, but there were plenty of wealthy people eager to put suffect consul on their resume. Well, during Cleander's time as the de facto ruler, he sold off consulships to the highest bidder. In fact, he set a record for the most consuls in a single year. 25. 25 consuls in a single year. All this bribery quickly made him insanely wealthy. With this fortune, Cleander began building estates for himself all over Italy. Lavish structures in prime areas. You already know that this made the senatorial neighbors jealous. This corrupt upstart had become richer than any of those old blue bloods. The senatorial class grew exasperated. With Cleander, of course, but also with Commodus. How long would he let this revolving cycle of corruption continue? This would have never happened under his father Marcus. We will leave Cleander and the imperial court there for the decade. with just a note that Cleander had in 188 made himself the head of the Praetorians. Not as prefect though, but as a new role called the dagger bearer, who had the two prefects subordinate to him. At the turn of the decade, Cleander was at the height of his power. But what was Commodus doing this whole time? Part 5. Commodus himself. We've talked a lot about the advisors of the emperor, but little about Commodus himself. That's because I try to avoid reciting lists of the moral failings or reprehensible personal lives that are pinned onto rulers. For the most part. Much of it's made up, and most of it isn't directly relevant to the running of the government or, quote, Western history. It's just tabloid talk. But how the Senate or the people or the army responds to this behavior is relevant. And to understand their responses, we have to know what it is they're reacting against. So, here we go. What has Commodus been doing while first his chamberlain, then his Praetorian prefect, then his next chamberlain run the administration for him? Let's get the Commodus gossip out of the way this decade, because next decade will be jam-packed with action. Like just about every figure villainized by Roman sources, Commodus was portrayed as a sexual deviant. His accusations range from relations with his first chamberlain, Sauterus, to numerous liaisons with prostitutes and mistresses. In the meantime, his relationship with his wife, Crispina, failed to produce any heirs. We don't need to dive into any of that gossip any further, but if you're interested, the Historia Augusta is going to be your source of choice. His hobbies drew wide disdain among the cultured classes. Cassius Dio says, Commodus was wholly devoted to pleasure and gave himself up to chariot racing. And Commodus devoted most of his life to ease and to horses and to combats of wild beasts and of men. He wasn't the first emperor to love chariot racing. This, at least, had some elite appeal. But his obsession with gladiators and fighting in the arena was scorned and disdained by the upper classes. He slaughtered a great number of animals in the arena. For example, all alone with his own hands, he dispatched 5 hippopotamuses, together with 2 elephants on 2 successive days. And he also killed rhinoceroses and a camelopard, which is a giraffe. Most often, these animals were put into the arena already wounded. The emperor was rarely in real danger. For example, we're told he once demonstrated his proficiency with a bow by killing 100 bears in the arena, from the safety of a balcony. It's hard for me to imagine the entertainment value of this slaughter past the first few kills, but apparently Commodus couldn't get enough of it. He also engaged in man-to-man combat, but as with the animals, his opponents were handicapped, either physically or with inferior weapons. His opponent would fight with blunted blades, Commodus with sharpened weapons. It was all undignified. We will go more into this next time, but he began to portray himself in these combat sports and officially as a manifestation of Hercules. He will commission statues and coins presenting himself as Hercules, with a club and wearing lion skins. If Commodus was a demigod, he was not a benevolent one. We've seen how his advisors terrorized the Senate, but Commodus also took part. With a failed assassination and the plotting of Perinus in mind, he was quick to sentence those who were suspicious or angered him to death. He apparently tried to eliminate the members of an old Roman family, the Quinctilii, because of their wealth. Other stories, like throwing his attendant into a furnace because the bathwater was too cool, sound like fabrications to me. The common theme, though, is a growing discontentment in all levels of society throughout the decade. Anxiety was high. Another round of the Antonine Plague seems to have swept through the capital at this time. Prices were also rising. Commodus, to pay off his soldiers and the people, and to fund his games and revelry, debased the currency. Now, his father had done the same, but at least that served a purpose. It was during Commodus's reign that the silver content of the denarius fell below 75%. For reference, 80 years earlier, a denarius was still greater than 90% silver. Inflation ticked a few notches higher, evaporating the wealth of the middle classes. No one had yet been able to turn back that dial. When it came to the army, the turnover of officers caused dissatisfaction outside of just Britannia. We hear of significant numbers of soldiers beginning to desert from the army. Beyond manpower issues, these desertions were dangerous. Groups of trained soldiers with nothing to do caused problems wherever they went. According to Herodian, a soldier named Maternus organized some of these deserters into a substantial band, which raided throughout Gaul and moved into Hispania. These rebel soldiers looted the countryside, freed prisoners, and attacked several towns. It was a real problem. We don't know many details of all of this. Herodian's account is a little over the top, too. According to him, Maternus dressed himself and a cadre of his men as praetorians, entered Italy, and attempted to assassinate Commodus. This isn't attested in Cassius Dio, so you can make up your own mind. In this telling, Maternus is caught in his disguise and executed. The Historia Augusta very indirectly hints at how these revolts may have ended. In speaking about the general Pescennius Niger, it says, "For he was sent to apprehend a body of deserters who were then ravaging Gaul in great numbers." These marauders were dealt with fairly quickly, so perhaps this source is tapping into legitimate history. We will see plenty more of this Pescennius Niger character next decade, as he tries to surf the tsunami waves of unrest that will grip the Roman world. This maelstrom about to sweep over the Romans wasn't without warning. Herodian tells of portents forecasting doom. We hear of stars visible during the day, animals born with strange deformities, tremors of the earth, and the temple of peace catching fire in Rome. The days of Commodus are numbered. The Roman peace, fractured by war, invasion, and plague last decade, will be ripped asunder by civil war. But that's next decade. I'll see you then.